Welcome to Israel Explained. Before we start talking about the topic, I'd like to acknowledge something that's going on right now. There are a lot of rumors that there have been a lot of IDF soldiers hurt in the Gaza Strip tonight. So let's all hope those rumors aren't true, and if anyone is hurt, they will have a speedy recovery. Among the injured is actor Idan Amedi, who plays Sagi in Fauda, and we wish him a speedy recovery. Today we're going to talk about the move in the war from um, a high intensity form of conflict to a low intensity form of conflict. We've already talked about the move to remove some reserve forces from Gaza in order to rest them, and also it would appear as part of the preparation for a lower intensity part of the conflict. Two statements in the last 24 hours have confirmed that that's the goal. Daniel Hagari, spokesperson for the IDF, said so in a press conference. And according to the Wall Street Journal, when Defense Minister Yoav Gallant gave them an interview, he, quote, indicated Israeli forces would be shifting from what he called the intense maneuvering phase of the war toward different types of special operations. Uh, the United States is definitely part of this decision, and that's certainly what most people will talk about in this regard. Biden gave a speech where he was interrupted by pro-Hamas protesters, and he said, "I understand their passion, and I've been quietly working with the Israeli government to get them to reduce and significantly get out of Gaza." End quote. And that's part of the US strategy, which is clearly at this point to lower the flames in Gaza and in Lebanon while maintaining visible support for Israel. That appears to be the strategy, a pretty good strategy considering that they're going into election year. Not necessarily very helpful to Israel, but a good strategy in that regard. This is not something that Biden wants. We're also talking about the possibility of renewing normalization with Saudi Arabia, which is something that Biden would really like to see happen over the next 2, 3 months. Um, but that's not everything that's happening. Sure, the United States feels Israel had a chance to destroy Hamas and hasn't made the most of it, but to some extent, Israelis are thinking the same thing, or many Israelis are thinking the same thing. The US is not forcing Israel to move to the low intensity phase of the conflict yet. They've given some runway, some leeway to the IDF to continue at this phase until the end of January. So the fact that it's happening now is basically an Israeli initiative. When asked why by the Wall Street Journal, Gallant gave a pretty good reasoning to it. He said, "My basic view is that we're fighting an axis, not a single enemy. Iran is building up military power around Israel in order to use it." But the fact that he told this to the Wall Street Journal and not to the Israeli media earned him a lot of criticism from the Likud. And when he was at a meeting of the party today, they asked him why, and some members of the Likud accused him of having lost the war. And it's a very good question why he didn't tell the Israeli public. He went to the Wall Street Journal and said instead. But instead of addressing that good question, he made the following comment. He said, quote, "This is internal military terminology. Not every woman from Ofakim and Sderot will tell us whether to move to the next phase or not." And that, of course, raises two questions. Why women? And why Ofakim and Sderot? Ofakim and Sderot are both what we call development towns, where the vast majority of the population is Mizrahi, and Mizrahi from lower levels on the socioeconomic ladder. So he seems definitely to be picking on the wrong people, especially since Sderot is one of the main victims of Hamas violence, both in terms of rockets and their raid on October 7th. So bad way to explain this from him on every level. And that ended up making more headlines in Israel than the official announcement that the low intensity part of the conflict is coming. Possibly because everyone already knew it, but also because that was a stupid way to handle it. But let's move that aside. Gallant has also showed a continued commitment to fighting the war. He's told soldiers today, as long as Hamas continues to exist as a military or governmental framework, we do not have the moral right to stop. And indeed, the IDF has been saying to everyone who will listen that fighting will continue throughout the year. Gallant has said that the next phase of the conflict will be longer than the current one as well. So that seems to be um, a consensus. But what's the point of the continued low intensity operation? Well, there are two main military goals. Obviously, there's releasing the hostages, although if the low intensity conflict will put the a right amount of pressure on Hamas to do that is an open question. But there's also two others. One is destroying the tunnels, which is a good goal that I totally agree with, and the other is trying to kill Sinwar. But according to recent publications in the Israeli media, Sinwar is hiding behind several human shields, Israeli hostages, and that is preventing Israel from killing him, even when they know where he is. It appears Israel, at least part of the time, has known where Sinwar is, but decided not to kill him. So, on some level, saying that killing Sinwar is a goal of the war when Israel is unwilling to pay the price in hostages to do that, I'm sure justifiably, is self defeating. Um, now, the fact that Israel's moving to a low intensity phase in the conflict doesn't necessarily mean that Israel's losing. There could be some great advantages in moving to that. A lower intensity stage of the conflict allows Israel to start moving the diplomatic process ahead. So it should be, when this happens, passing the baton from the military to the government to find a diplomatic solution. Unfortunately, it's not clear that that's going to happen. There are two major reasons the passing of the baton from the military to the political process is stalling. One, and perhaps the most important one, Israel hasn't given Hamas a real reason to surrender. If Sinwar can stay alive, and if Hamas can continue to govern in Rafah, sure, they've sustained some significant losses, but there's no reason for them to give up. They can stay where they are while Israel remains in the Gaza Strip, continue to attack soldiers, like maybe they did today, eventually making it too costly for Israel to stay in the hope that they will leave, like they left in Lebanon. And on some level, that could end up being worse than Lebanon because the area is urban. Now, right now, the population in northern Gaza isn't being allowed to return. But the longer this conflict goes on, the more difficult that's going to be. There's going to be more and more pressure on Israel to let them in as the low intensity section continues. If this goes on for a year, Israel's going to keep them out for a year. That will have a price. Blinken's already said that displaced civilians in Gaza should return home as Israel moves to a lower intensity phase. And if the conflict has no end or no foreseeable end, keeping them away from their home crosses the line into ethnic cleansing, which is a serious problem for Israel's relations diplomatically. It's a serious problem morally. It's a serious problem as the ICJ is looking at what Israel's doing in the Gaza Strip. I don't know how sustainable that is. Once civilians go back into northern Gaza, assuming that happens at some point, it becomes increasingly difficult for Israel to stay there. So Hamas might be looking at an improvement in its strategic position rather than it getting worse, so they don't have a reason to surrender. Another problem, perhaps smaller but significant, is that Israel isn't providing enough concessions regarding a future Palestinian state and the involvement of the PA in order to involve the United States, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and that entire alliance. Right now, they are not fully backing an Israeli diplomatic move because they don't see it as realistic and they don't see it as one that they can defend in front of their public. So Israel is in trouble in terms of moving from the military stage to the diplomatic stage. Um, and Hamas has started shooting rockets at Israel again. As long as they're in Rafah, they can continue to shoot rockets. And Israel is as we know, very hesitant to go into Rafah and take it over because there's so many people there and because of the problems that it will cause with Egypt. So what it's looking like right now is Israel is lowering the intensity of the conflict at a stage where it's not clear how that moves into a diplomatic and political situation. And the biggest nightmare we have here is Israel ends up in a quagmire fighting terrorism with no end in sight to losing its soldiers. And on that happy note, let's take some questions. I have 4 questions today, so thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. Harry Newhoff asked, you said the IDF strategy of fighting is different in the south than in the north. That is because they are using the cover and move strategy by having more soldiers. Why didn't they do that in the north? Well, in the north, Israel did a sort of shock and awe operation because it was coming into large areas that were heavily defended, and it couldn't use that kind of concentration of forces. It had to break through the initial defenses in order to do that. It had to go into the north in order to secure the Gaza envelope and stop the missiles from falling, which to a great extent it has, even though the occasional missile is falling. It had to do that fast because of the diplomatic flock and in order to get results with the hostages. So it was a completely different situation that required shock and awe. In Khan Yunis, it's going into very specific areas. The lines of defense have already been broken. It already got the first hostage release. So we're talking about a completely different situation. You can't bring that kind of concentration of forces into as wide an area as the north, when in certain areas of central Khan Yunis, you can. It's really that simple. CCA Tercero asks, do you have any more news about a possible hostage deal with Blinken in the area? Well, about half an hour ago, I did not have news, but I do now. You have to keep on top of things in this constantly moving conflict. According to Qatari sources, there are talks again in Cairo involving Qatar and Egypt about a possible hostage deal. That's a big deal because we haven't had any talks in a few days. I don't think a deal is nearby, but that is certainly good news. Alia Aloha asks, why does the Lebanese government and the armed forces tolerate Hezbollah? Why don't they, I will be blunt, take care of them? Well, the most simple answer to that is that the Lebanese army probably wouldn't be able to defeat Hezbollah if it wanted to. It would probably lose. Hezbollah is stronger. The Lebanese army is not known for its bravery or effectiveness. It spent the entire civil war in Lebanon, which was waged from 1975 to 1988, in the barracks, hiding from all the militias. It's not particularly strong, but more important than that, it's made up of members from different ethnic groups, and those different ethnic groups have their own preferences over whether they want Hezbollah to win or whether they want other groups to win. They're not a trustworthy fighting source. The truth is, Lebanon is almost a failed state. One of the reasons for that is that its military is not functioning. If you don't have a functioning military, it's very hard to have a functioning state. That's also another reason that Iran and Syria have done whatever they wanted, and Israel in certain points, whatever they wanted in Lebanon, and there's no army to stop them. My friend Syra Bano asks, I wanted to ask about the ICJ. We know that the ICJ has no enforcement power, so why has Israel decided to defend itself at the ICJ's hearing on the Gaza genocide? Okay, good question. And there was a lot of arguments about that in Israel. The Israeli instinct, whenever one of these judicial bodies gathers to talk about Israel, is to ignore it and not engage with it in order to not give it legitimacy. I think that's a dumb strategy. I think it always has been because Israel ignoring it does not give it legitimacy. It just makes Israel seem like um, it's a rogue state or something like that. Having said that, very often Israel has no chance of winning, and therefore it doesn't matter all that much if they ignore it or don't ignore it. Like say when there was um, the opinion rather than a judgment from the ICJ on the separation barrier on the wall that Israel built in order to stop terrorism. There was zero chance that Israel was going to get that to go in its favor, and it didn't cooperate. And if it had cooperated, it wouldn't have mattered. This case is different. Israel feels, I wouldn't say it's optimistic, but it feels that it might actually win. by the most basic standards of what a genocide is, and that's what this is. South Africa is claiming that Israel is committing a genocide. Israel's not committing a genocide, and there's strong evidence that it's not. It may be using too much force, or maybe it's not using it in a pinpointed enough and proportional manner. I don't know, but none of that means a genocide. A genocide is an intentional attempt to destroy a large part of civilian population. And Israel is engaged in a difficult war and has made effort to spare civilian lives, like, for example, by asking them to leave the areas where it was fighting. So it feels like it has evidence to prove that it hasn't committed genocide, and it's worth it for it to fight because it might actually get a good outcome um, from its perspective. So that's why it's doing that. You said it has no enforcement mechanism. You're right. And if Israel loses, I don't expect them to listen to anything that the ICJ has to say. But it will be a major blow that Israel's enemies will constantly wave in its face, and it'll make it more difficult for the United States to defend Israel. And right now, Israel is less concerned about whether the ICJ will say it's genocide or not, because that's a few years down the line, probably three, but rather they don't want an emergency order to come out ordering Israel to cease fire. Again, that won't stop Israel from fighting, but it could make it more difficult for Israel's allies to defend it in the United Nations. And since Israel thinks that it has a good shot of beating this, it's using its full, um, pardon the phrase, firepower to stop it, including bringing its most luminary judicial voice, Aharon Barak, to be a judge, and bringing famed Professor Malcolm Shaw to represent them at the ICJ. Okay, so thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Israel Explained. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon and listening to my podcast, History of the Land of Israel. I will be here tomorrow, hopefully, with some good news.